assuming all of you can hear me. I want to thank Dave and CSI Allentown for inviting me to come. And this is a great turnout. I wish we could fill a room like this at National Convention on issues related to the standards. I think it's exciting, certainly. I wanted to cover challenge. There we go. So for those of you who are earning CEU credits today, we're going to talk about some of the contents of the International Rate Construction Code. We're going to examine some of the differences between IGCC and other model codes, primarily standards and rating systems, as understanding the distinction between the three. We're going to discuss how, as members of the design community, the construction community, you can be part of the technical code development process, and why actually you specifically are so important to that process. And also explore, get a little bit into the potential changes to the standard of care affecting architects and other design professionals like engineers, and in some cases specification owners. So I want to get a sense of who you are today. Obviously, by the title of the conference, I would assume you're specifiers. But I'm curious if there are registered architects in the room, engineers, PEs, all right. And who else is in the room? You have product reps, anyone from material interests, anyone that works in sort of policy or association. Okay, so primarily architects and engineers. Well, the point of this presentation, you know, we're trying to do this at the local, state, and the national level, is to remind all of you working on the technical side of architecture and construction, how important voice is in the development of model codes, and in particular with the development of the International Rate Construction Code. There's a sort of a role for everybody, but in particular for building scientists and just to back up a little bit, back up more than a few steps. Building codes originated in response to crises. I think we all understand that sort of both anecdotally and also when you read the code, historically it started with fires, with storms, even terrorism, energy crises. Back to the energy code, Standard 90.1 in 1975 was a result of the energy crisis at that time. We're seeing it again. IGCC in some ways is a reaction to that timeline. So what we see in the codes is fire prevention, egress of occupants, protection of property, certainly health, safety, and welfare, and the welfare part of health, safety, and welfare, of course, is being translated into environmental welfare, welfare of the community, and it's sort of an extended definition of what welfare means. So for the codes, that has historically meant fire safety, structural integrity, buildings shouldn't fall down and kill people, certainly that's a big synonym. But over time what we've seen is that we've added things. So light, ventilation, mechanical systems of equipment, certainly, but also more recently, energy efficiency. And in a more expanded codes realm, we see sustainability issues entering codes for the first time. Now, back about 13 years ago or so, USGBC and other organizations, other individuals within the design community started LEAD, started the Industry Building Council, and that was to kind of drive some of these issues into everyday practice. Well, what I'm going to show you today is that the IGCC is sort of that happening. One major thing one issue is that it's one thing to have a voluntary standard or rating system, but it's quite another to take those ideas, translate them into code language, and then actually have compliance. That's what we're going to talk about today. So the AIA has a policy on codes and standards. We stand behind having one concise group of codes. Obviously, having one ginormous book full of structural, mechanical, all the life safety stuff and fire and all that in one book is kind of absurd. But the idea of having a family of codes that cover the issues that are all coordinated and consolidated and having meshed with design practice as it stands today is part of the policy. ICC, the International Code Council, is a publisher of model codes. The authors of the code codes are people like you that work in the design profession, in the construction industry, architects, engineers, specifiers, certainly, building scientists, envelope experts, building product manufacturer representatives. They all have a role in authoring codes. And I'll talk a little bit about the governmental consensus process that produces and all codes. But just to back up a little bit, again, on history, what we have here in this diagram is that life safety codes sort of form a base of codes. And we have this dotted line that represents sort of the minimum standard of care. So when you think about it, over time, codes have gotten stricter. It doesn't matter if you're looking at a structural code, code, or whatever, they've gotten part of the need over time. And so that dotted line moves up. Because energy codes, which we've represented on the top, it's sort of like the topsoil in this diagram, that standard of care has gotten tougher. It's increased faster. If you look at the milestones, whether it's the first energy crisis in the 80s, maybe it had a dip. Energy conservation wasn't as much on the forefront. There's all sorts of geopolitical reasons for that. But then right around the 90s, USGBC launches LEAD. We have in the early 2000s the 2030 challenge. And things in the industry have driven that line upward and made stringencies increase in both standard 90.1, which is probably the energy code that you're familiar with, or the International Energy Conservation Code, which is offered by the ICC, in references 90.1 in many cases. So they've gotten tougher. The overlap where the IGCC is in this diagram is that rating systems, which have been driving sustainable design practice and energy efficiency, kind of rain in sort of shape of a cloud, kind of rain down concepts into the regulatory arena. And so things happen first on a voluntary basis, and then they get translated in the code eventually. And the IGCC right now is at that point of overlap. So if we look at it a little bit different way, if we look at just ASHRAE standard 91, what we see is that it was sort of static from 1975 through the 80s, and then you have a big dip in 1989, 1990, and then a dramatic increase in stringency in the prescriptive code for 90.1, all the way down to where we are today. ASHRAE 2010, 2010 is the toughest it's ever been. Its counterpart, the IGCC 2012, I can say, you know, and from a personal level, having worked on a major code change for the recent IGCC, I don't know where we can go from here in prescriptive energy codes to make them any tougher than they do. I don't think it's possible. The prescriptive codes are sort of on their last stand when it comes to energy efficiency stringency. We can't make insulation any thicker. We can't increase SHGC any more in windows. I think, you know, we're reaching a limit. So interestingly, the IGCC is meant to overlap the IECC and beat it by 10%. So that's a big ask. But backing up, I want to talk a little bit about the difference between code standards and rating system. Codes are the letter of the law. They're the floor. I call standards the floor tiles because they're like the specific best practices that you kind of apply to the floor. Often they are embedded in the floor. Embedded in the codes. And then rating systems form the ceiling, or you could even say the sky, because really the movement in sustainable design is to go from sort of net zero impact to actually environmentally positive buildings that, you know, make the water cleaner before they release it into the environment, or they have positive impacts surrounding their inhabitants, things that actually improve the environment around. So in a little bit more detail, rating systems are also intentionally zero code. So don't think of LEAD as sort of comparing to IGCC or competing with it. It's meant to rise above. And actually, the advent of the IGCC, you know, it's impossible, I think, to align and say, okay, LEAD certified and silver. You can't really do that for some technical reasons, but they're meant to work together. So that diagram I showed you where the energy code, all the codes and all the base codes are moving up. The IGCC is meant to kind of be an umbrella over that and to represent a higher standard of care when it comes to sustainable development. if we look at standards, they are consensus-based documents. You have a couple of processes that you go through to get a standard. And one of those processes is offered by ANSI, and there is a specific makeup of the committees that author the standards. They have to have a certain percentage from each stakeholder group. In the case of the ICC, they have what they're calling the governmental consensus process. They do have representation from industry as well as building officials and architects and engineers. And the idea is that in the end, with both standards and codes, you get wide industry representation so that you don't have one group with more of an influence over the content of the code, or the standard in this case, than any other. Now, I would say it's probably safe to say that given standard 189.1, standard 90.1 are written, I would say primarily by engineers and people and offered by people that specify mechanical equipment, that there might be some really excellent content on mechanical equipment efficiency, but it's meant to be, it is a consensus standard. So in the case of codes, here I have a picture of the 1300 codes, and they're typically prescriptive, meaning checklists, minimums that you have to meet, but the evolution of codes is changing from prescriptive to what we're calling outcome-based. How we get from prescriptive to outcome-based is kind of a tricky dance, especially when you go beyond, or you talk about going beyond the certificate of occupancy. Code officials start scratching their heads saying, how are we going to do that? And certain jurisdictions have infrastructure to do that. Some creative thinking going on there in places like Seattle, and most recently I heard a story about what Vancouver is doing. It's absolutely amazing. But the idea of taking essentially what was a checklist or a printout from ComCheck or whatever it is that was prescriptive that you were following, going from that to actually measuring and then verifying the energy performance of the building, that's huge. It's the biggest step, it's the biggest leap we've ever made in the history of the So there, as I said before, there's a role for all of these documents in the code arena, in the code and standards arena. Rating systems are meant to lead the way, no pun intended. Standards are consensus-based, best practice documents that are embedded often in codes, but are also can be written in mandatory language that can get adopted as a code. And then codes are intended to act as the letter of the law. If you look at LEED Cal Green, which I'm going to call the first actual green building code in the country, ASHRAE 189.1, and the IGCC, which is being marketed as the first green model code, because it is the first model code, to be fair. They all include similar information. It's not possible right now to compare apples to apples. They really are sort of apples, pears, and oranges, and I'm not sure what pears are codes. Pears are really strange, they all include site planning, water conservation, certainly energy conservation, that's the big one, material resource conservation, in some cases provisions for existing buildings. Of course, after a building is built, it immediately becomes an existing building. The IGCC addresses that in a chapter. But they are fundamentally different. And I get asked a lot, how does IGCC compare to LEED? Well, it doesn't compare to LEED. It exists again in sort of the same framework with LEED in that it's got sustainable design content and intention, but they're not the same thing.